Welcome to the Conshy Coaching Podcast, where we take the concepts of mindset and energy leadership coaching and make them real so that you can get out of your own way, beat the burnout, and create a life and career that you love. I'm your host, Jen Massey. Hello, and welcome to the 11th episode of the Conshy Coaching Podcast. Today, I am very excited to welcome back Rob Tull as a guest on my show. As a certified energy leadership and success coach at his company Path to Coaching, Rob guides working parents down the path to personal and professional fulfillment so that they can enjoy their life with passion and energy. He is also a published author, public speaker, a father, a compliance executive, and so much more. Rob, thank you so much for being back on my show today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
When I first had you on my show for episode 4, it was back in January, and a lot has changed since then with the pandemic and stay-at-home orders and really just the abrupt transition in life as we know it. So tell me what it has been like for you and what's been going on in Arizona.
Actually, yeah, a lot has changed. So from my perspective, there's really two things that have happened. There's the what's happening with my life and then what's happening with my circumstances. So what I see happening in life is the way that I support an investment firm taking responsibility for people's well-being and really thinking about how businesses are responding to this situation, both from a perspective of how does the business continue, from the economic impact to what does that actually mean for the employees and the people. And so it's been a really interesting ability to toggle between those two perspectives of an organization and people as humans. And what I will say is on that side, it's really changed the dynamic of companies and how they see employees as people in their lives. When you have all these people working from home, it's that forced integration of work and life. And if you recall the Seinfeld episode with George Costanza, where his girlfriend starts meeting Elaine and Jerry, and he starts talking about worlds colliding, and he says, it's the end of George as you know him. That is happening for a lot of people because it's causing work to infiltrate life and life to infiltrate work. So that's one of the things I'm seeing, and it, for as uncomfortable that is for people, I find it beautiful. I think it's awesome. And then from the circumstantial perspective, so I live in Arizona, and so Arizona has been really late to the party in terms of partially responsiveness and really just the impact of coronavirus. And I don't mean that lightly in terms of late to the party. I think it will affect everybody universally. And so when you don't see it happening in an area, it's not that that area is immune. I think that area is going to experience it, and it's just late. And that's what we're seeing here in Arizona. What I will say is, compared to my friends and family in the Northeast, it's been late spring, or I guess it's been early spring for them, late winter, early spring. And so the weather was kind of miserable. I was hearing from my mom and some friends back in Pennsylvania, and then the weather just started to recently turn nice. But the big thing is there hasn't been this constant urge to come outside because of the weather. In Arizona, it's been blissfully beautiful this entire time. And so I keep wanting to go outside and just go bask in the sun and stuff. And there are some things I can do, but being confined in home and not being able to go swimming or not being able to go to dog parks and stuff has felt this. It's been a little uncomfortable to have that bait right at the tip of your nose and to be reminded of it every day. Is it a first world problem? Absolutely. But it really is, you do see it affecting people here with that type of restriction. So it is a really interesting scenario, and I think there's a lot to learn from this, and it'll be interesting to see how we adapt.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been such an extreme transition. And because of that, there has been so many fears involved. From the initial shutdown, when it was fears around what working from home looks like, while also having to teach our children and having our spouses in the house the entire time. Or if you don't have a spouse or don't have kids, the fear of being home alone and not seeing our families for an extended period of time. Now, after 9 weeks, we've transitioned out of those initial fears and have found routine among the chaos. And whatever that routine looks like, it's different for everyone. But now that governments are starting to reopen things, a whole new set of fears is coming back in full force. And last weekend was a perfect example of it here in Pennsylvania, where it was the first weekend that it really started to feel like summer. It was like 80 degrees outside. They had just reopened outdoor recreational facilities like parks and golf courses and driving ranges. And on one end of the spectrum, you have people that have been itching to go outside and enjoy these things. And then you have the other side of the spectrum, which is people who are afraid that it's still not safe enough to reopen these activities in these facilities. And they're being fearful that those who are partaking in these activities are not following the social distancing rules. And those fears are completely fair and justified because there have definitely been cases where people are ignoring the rules and not wearing masks. And all of this just leads into all of these different fears of like, should I go out? Should I not go out? What am I touching? What's cross-contaminated? So the challenge with things slowly starting to reopen up and the two ends of the spectrum is that people that fall in the second bucket are almost more likely to be stuck now than they were before things started to reopen up. So what you and I are going to talk about today is fear and how people can start to become fearless. And we're going to talk about how we can start taking calculated risks so that we don't end up in the second bucket, which is getting so stuck and living in so much fear that we never actually let our life resume.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a big issue, that idea of the feeling of getting stuck, because part of that comes from change, right? We're dealing in an environment that dynamic right now. And the concern is that people will feel stuck until the change stops. And the reality is we probably have a long time of a changing situation in front of us, that to feel stuck that long, that's going to feel like frozen in ice, and that's not going to be a way to live.
I was on a call the other night with a bunch of women, many of them moms, and I know you have kids, so I'm interested to hear your perspective on this. These women, and especially the moms, were saying that they were really afraid that summer was going to be canceled, that they're not going to be able to send their kids to camp. And even in the virtual environment, it has been some form of structure for their kids and allowed them to find a routine. And when school ends in June, they're going to lose that structure. So now there's fears around what is that change going to look like? And how are they now going to balance work when their kids don't have virtual classes or a way to get their energy out by being at camp and playing with their friends all day?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's a real fear. And again, that's a changing dynamic. And what I find most compelling in that situation is typically you have, work continues throughout the year, right? The school year is one of the things where there's that element of change where you have the summer. And we have created constructs to fill in the gap of school, right? Whether that's summer camp or whether that's vacations or some other routine for the kids. So when you remove this system, just like by removing kids from school, it's going to put that onus on parents. But parents already have time and attention and energy allocated to work. That's where businesses need to be flexible and really understand that the employee is facing a different challenge at home where they're going to have to step into a gap that's left by an institution or structure. And so there's going to need to be flexibility there until the parent is able to identify what's going to work for their family, whether that's enrolling kids in summer school programs online, whether that's setting up virtual play dates or ways of interaction, whether that just means fully embracing the summer reading program that's recommended. Like, it's got to be something, but that's not something that occurs without thought and effort. And so that thought and effort has to come from someplace. And so businesses are going to need to be flexible and understanding that parents were going to have a new problem set to solve once school is out. And part of it is going to be solved inside the household. And then part of it's going to be solved with the community because it's a common problem, right? And it's instead of existing with school families, it might exist with neighborhood families. There was a great article I read the other day that was talking about how neighborhoods are co-opting at-home school, essentially, where people are raising their hand in the neighborhood as being kind of the leader for a particular topic or activity, and the neighborhood kind of coalescing around that individual in a safe way, whether that's outside or whether that's virtually online. And so I think that's what you're going to have is people are going to need to solve it themselves, but they need the time and space to solve it.
Ooh, I like that concept of the community coming together with school activities and to leverage the strengths and talents of parents in the neighborhood, because that is another aspect of resilience, which is understanding how your talents and skills can benefit the greater good. And that concept may be happening here, but from what I'm seeing on social media and hearing from many of my clients is that parents are still trying to wear the hat of being full-time teachers for every subject while also trying to balance their full-time job. So I hope that this concept of this community involvement and community co-op can help some of our listeners with different ideas of how they can leverage even the end of the school year, but also as they look forward into summer.
Yeah.
And I do think that you're correct that this is going to be a time of adaptation and the need for the community to continue to come together by helping the at-risk community as far as running errands for the elderly, but also in addition to helping working parents.
Yeah.
And I think that you're absolutely correct that in order to adapt and grow and navigate this situation, people are going to need the time and space to process.
Yeah.
And as coaches, that's what we do, right? Like we give our clients the time and space to think about things without judgment, without fear. And collectively as a community and as a society and as leaders in organizations, we are all going to have to get a lot better about giving each other the time and space to actually think about what this looks like at an individual level so that individuals can meet their basic needs of safety and security, and ultimately then allow individuals to transition out of survival mode so that they can start thinking about what it looks like at the bigger picture and step out of the comfort zone and start taking risks so that they can start living and thriving again. So on that, let's dive into risk. And when I talk about taking calculated risks, I really look at them as a way to becoming fearless. And for me, when I think about becoming fearless, it's not about living without fear. It's about living despite of fear and living in parallel to the fears. So knowing that fears are there and that they exist, but not letting the fears control our lives and hold us back from experiencing greatness. And I personally like the term calculated risks because there's certain risks out there that are just too risky. Like, even though I went canyoning in Switzerland, which involves jumping off cliffs into water, I personally won't go bungee jumping or jump out of an airplane because I'm giving my control to a rope or a parachute. But a calculated risk, even when I think about how it relates to this pandemic, it's equivalent to going food shopping and wearing a mask. Studies have shown that the masks only prevent about 50% of the germs from reaching me. But I need food, so I've calculated that I'm willing to accept the risk and go food shopping with a mask because it's better than no food or no mask at all. And as a compliance executive, I know that you deal with risks on a daily basis. So I would love to ask you some more questions and have you dive into what risks are, why understanding them is important, things people can do to start taking risks during the pandemic, and even some of the mistakes, even though I don't really like that word, but things that trip people up when it comes to evaluating risks so that we can start to help my listeners move past these feelings of fear and angst and really allow them to step forward into this elongated transition and period of unknown with excitement and resiliency and the ability to really navigate whatever curveball gets thrown our way tomorrow or next week or next month.
So I love the idea that you said calculated risks. And what's funny is I never thought that I would use all of my professional education in risk management in real life. But that's exactly what this has become. And it's the idea of what you're talking about is this concept of like risk appetite. How much risk are you willing to consume? When you say, you're not willing to go bungee jumping and jump out of because your risk appetite isn't that high. And when we think about risks and you're talking about going to the grocery store, it's that idea of risks come from what's the impact of the risk and what's the probability of it. And the less often I go to the grocery store means the frequency I encounter it is lower, therefore it's safer. And it's so funny because these are concepts that like businesses have had to deal with, and just in my educated field or in the field of my profession, that that's always been part of the jargon. And so now it's in real life, and it's funny, it's ironic to see that, and such an interesting thing.
What's funny is even when I look at risk appetite as it relates to the social aspect of this pandemic, it's like I will go driveway drink with my neighbors
Hmm.
and we'll be at least 6 feet apart and we'll be following the rules. But the moment neighbors who I don't know as well show up is the moment that my risk appetite drops.
Hmm.
Because it's like, I don't know you people. I don't know who you've been around. And frankly, you don't know anything about me. So if you were to get infected, the likelihood of you telling me that is slim, which means I'll have no idea that I was exposed. And it's just this whole concept of what risks are we willing to take and accept in order to actually live a life that we're comfortable with, that fulfills our needs. And I really like that word appetite, because I have an appetite to fulfill a need and core value of connection and socialization by sitting in someone's driveway, but I'm not hungry enough to fulfill it with people that I don't know. And the moment they show up, it's like, nope, I'm out. So we keep throwing this word risk around. Can you define what risk is?
Yeah, when I think about risk is really the fear of pain or the fear of suffering. And it can be physical pain, it could be pain, it could be emotional pain, it could be pain that's associated with change, or even the pain from like destabilizing, deeply held beliefs. So it comes down to thinking, oh, this is going to hurt, this is going to make me uncomfortable, or worst case, this is going to change my life forever. So that's what I think about as risk.
Yeah, and I think that definition aligns perfectly to this pandemic, right? Like, it's not just the fear of physical pain if we get sick, or the emotional pain that will occur if a loved one gets sick, or dealing with the emotions that have started to come up for us now that we're left alone with our thoughts for elongated periods of time. But that destabilization of deeply held beliefs. Every truth and every belief that we have lived by leading up to this pandemic has been challenged and in many cases proven wrong. So the belief that we have to do our jobs from an office setting, or the belief that we need to have an incredibly busy schedule, whether it's constantly jumping between work and friends and family, to people with kids who also have to then layer in sports and scouts and other things. The truth is, we don't actually need those things to survive. And in many cases, that overpacked schedule was actually preventing us from growing and addressing some deeply rooted issues. And all of that stuff is nice to have, right? The socialization, the sports, the scouts, the happy hours. But the truth that we need them, and the truth that our life has to exist outside of our four walls, has been proven wrong. And because of that, we're starting to question what other beliefs and truths may also be challenged and changed in the future. And that's really uncomfortable because we still don't know the full extent of how this pandemic is going to change our lives. We know that it will change, but we don't know how. And when we talk about risks and we talk about assessing risks, there's two types, right? There's voluntary and there's involuntary risk. So, can you talk to me a little bit more about what these are and how they're different?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first one would be voluntary risks. And those are the kind of risks that are created by actions that we initiate. So in your example of going to the grocery store or going out in this situation, that's we make a choice and we accept the risk associated with that. So in common life, it's we make the choice to move or to commit to a partner, change jobs, have kids, start a new business, or anything else where we are actively stepping out of either our comfort zone or our current status. And they're decisions that we make where they generally have known upsides and downsides. And we sit there and we think about them critically and we weigh them and assess them, and then we plan for them before acting. And so those are the risks. So the voluntary risks are we cause them to come into being. And then involuntary risks are different. They exist as a fundamental law because we live in a world we can't control. And so these are not risks that are born out of action, but rather born out of existence. And that's the risk of like illness, death, war, natural disasters, famine, society issues, and the pandemic we're facing. And we cannot assess and weigh these risks and just simply conclude, nah, it's beyond my appetite. I'm not going to do the action and therefore avoid this risk. There's no way to avoid these risks. So unlike a voluntary risk, we just need to accept these risks as a baseline for living. And where that distinction of how much we control causing the risk, like the potential of the risk, and how much we don't really comes into how we mitigate those risks. And like voluntary risks, they're mitigated by external resources and decisions that can counteract the risk. So the idea of, hey, I'm going to take a new job. So that's a risk. I'm going to initiate taking a new job. And if I lose my new job, I'm going to need to find another one, or maybe I'll go back. So we already start to plan countermeasures to the risk. If I want to move, so my initiation is I'm going to move. My house depreciates, therefore I'm going to delay moving. If my partner leaves me, I will get support from my friends. If my child has a learning disability, I'm going to get them additional help. So what happens is with a voluntary risk, we initiate an action, a risk happens, and we react accordingly. And so it's that idea of we thought this through and we have countermeasures to take. Involuntary risks, because it has no basis on our decision making, are very different. So what happens is they tend to be unanticipated. We're often unprepared, and what that causes is a lot of questions to come up. So the first reaction is questions of like, why did this happen? How did this happen? What now? And so they're often mitigated instead of external resources, we need our own internal resources to mitigate that. And what I mean is we need to rely on our own resilience, our ability to remain calm, clarity, our fortitude, our flexibility. And those internal resources allow us to accept the risk that's occurring, process it, consider what's going on, and then respond in a way that mitigates the risk. So whereas with a voluntary risk, you kind of think that stuff through in advance. With an involuntary risk, there's no ability to think that stuff through in advance. And so the challenge is getting past that questioning phase and searching for answers of why. Because what happens is when those questions of like why and how did this happen are so overwhelming that we often rebound into denial, right? This isn't happening. This isn't so bad. It's fate. This isn't really happening. And we go into like an ostrich response where we just bury our head in the sand and we don't want to deal with it. And so we never get to the spot of accepting it or processing it or responding. And then the biggest hurdle that I think really is needed in order to get to the level of acceptance is this idea that we have this false belief that if an involuntary risk didn't happen, things would be the same, it would be constant, it would be normal. And that's just a fallacy. It's the idea that, like, hey, if this pandemic didn't happen, everything would be the same. And it's like, well, that's not true. And we need to let go of that fiction because everything changes all the time. There is no constant, there is no normal. Like, impermanence is the way of life in the world. So that rebounding into denial is really counterproductive. when trying to mitigate an involuntary risk. So that's, in short, those are the two types of risks, the voluntary and the involuntary, and what distinguishes them and how we mitigate them.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for explaining those in a way that made them so easy to understand. With my background and what I used to do in corporate, I dealt a lot with risk and risk assessments. But hearing you transcribe it into what it looks like for the pandemic, it was really enlightening and actually resurfaced some things that I hadn't really thought about before. But what you hit on at the end there is 100% correct. And that is that change is the only constant. And I like how clear you made it that we have to stop the belief that if the pandemic didn't happen, that life would be okay. Because there's no way to guarantee that. Because a whole world of other things would have happened in the past 2.5 months while we were operating in the normal hustle and bustle of life that would have exposed us to many of these voluntary and involuntary risks. And the two other things that you also hit on in there have been things that I've been talking about a lot in my recent podcast episodes and blogs and on social media. And that is acceptance, which is really what allows us to move out of that survival mode and start assessing our risks and making conscious choices. And the second thing is resilience, which really comes from knowing that we have the inner strength to face whatever comes our way. It doesn't mean settling or being a brick wall or bypassing what comes our way, but it means knowing that I'm strong enough to actually process and navigate and handle whatever comes my way. And these are things that I personally have been working on since starting my own self-growth journey, which I know has helped me to consciously navigate and keep an open mind since the onset of this pandemic. But I've been focusing on acceptance and resilience specifically because I believe that understanding these concepts and having tools to implement these concepts will really help my clients and my listeners navigate this transition and walk out the other side stronger than they were even when this first started. And a part of acceptance and resilience is assessing these two types of risks, the voluntary and involuntary risks, and really starting to understand what they are and how we can react to them, right? So like with the pandemic, evaluating the general state of unknown and assessing what is it that I can actually control in this moment, like leaving the house, wearing a mask, how often I go food shopping. And how we assess usually leaves us in two places, right? It will either leave us stuck because we've overanalyzed and decided that non-action was better than action, or on the flip side, if we didn't analyze enough and just jumped in with both feet, then retroactively, we're going to look back and think, oh man, I wish I had thought that one through just a little bit more. But in both cases, there's a judgment of the result, whether we're judging the fact that we didn't take action and got stuck, or judging that maybe we should have taken a little bit more time to think about everything that would have happened from our action. And in both cases, there's an opportunity to better calculate our response to risk next time. And you mentioned that there's actually 4 main misconceptions or mistakes that people make when assessing risks. So I'm wondering if you could dive in and talk about what these mistakes are and possibly give us some ideas so that we can be a little bit more prepared next time that we're faced with risks, and maybe we won't make these mistakes moving forward.
Yeah, definitely. And then the last one I get to is actually going to tie in your acceptance and resiliency theme because it is so essential. But the first one is one of the 4 energy blocks that we discussed in episode 4, which is assumption. And when we experience something, especially something that is emotionally charged, it imprints on us. And the consequence of that risk is real because it's available for us to recall. And we do that when we consider future events. It's that hot stove equivalent, right? I did this once, this terrible thing happened, therefore I will never do it again. And essentially, if I do it again, the same result will occur. And we're dealing with fear here. And the important question when challenging an assumption is, how certain are we that the outcome will result in the same pain. And we assume that the same outcome will occur because it's the best way to avoid pain, right? So risk is all about the fear of pain. And when we have a prior experience, and especially if it's emotionally charged, that pain is often exaggerated in our memory. And what that does is it strengthens the validity of the assumption. It was so terribly painful that if it's likely to happen again, if I do the same thing, no, thank you, not doing it. So it emphasizes that assumption. And the negative experience becomes so strong that it's the stuff of legend. And it upholds that assumption about that prior decision and the situation. And what happens is that an assumption is real, and so the risk is real, and therefore we're going to avoid that at all costs. So assumption tends to be the most common, and it's a very strong mistake that people make when considering risks. Now, what's different between this first mistake or error and the second one is in the first mistake, it's through experience. The second one, which is also another energy block, is a limiting belief. And unlike an assumption, we don't base a limiting belief on direct experience. So a limiting belief is something that's usually passed down to us by, family or friends, society, and then even the stories we tell ourselves. So fabricated theories we come up with in how the world works. And when we adopt a belief that forecasts certain risks or uses imagined risks as barriers to certain wants and desires, it's very forceful. And if you think back, let's use the example of Pinocchio, right? And Pleasure Island. The story that it was telling kids is the risk of turning into a donkey would definitely keep an impressionable child from smoking, drinking, or gambling or the other unsavory behavior. So that's how a limiting belief functions. And so when that gets passed down to us, it's very effective. And so we adopt these limiting beliefs. And when we're presented with situations or opportunities, like are we going to challenge a risk or take on a risk? We use that framework of the limiting belief to interpret the situation in a way that confirms the limiting belief, right? I'm going to look for evidence that supports my limiting belief because that's my framework for decision making. And so I've safely avoided a risk by continuing to rely on my limiting belief. And when we have a limiting belief, one of the critical questions to identify is the thing that's holding me back a limiting belief. One of the things we can do is kind of ask ourselves, who is the inner counsel that we hear that's assessing the risk against the limiting belief? Whose voice is it? Is it my mom telling me, are you really going to do that? You're really going to move across the country and leave us here for ourselves? You're really going to give up your friends and family? It's that idea of where did that impression come from? Is it a role model, as a mentor? Is it my own inner voice? In other words, did I fabricate this thing myself? So those two energy blocks, that idea of assumption and limiting beliefs, those are very strong, and they tend to account for most of the ways that we avoid taking risks.
Yeah, and I'm going to jump in here real quick because those two energy blocks are so strong and really blind us from seeing the whole picture. And I was also thinking about the other two energy blocks, interpretations and gremlins, and how all four just feed off of each other. So with interpretations, it's like, what stories are we telling ourselves about why or how this is happening? Like, is this happening to me, or am I just part of the bigger picture? And how does that story fuel our assumptions or limiting beliefs about if we can handle the risk that we're faced with? So, like you were saying with assessing whose voice is guiding us, if we determine that it's not the voice of our parents or society, and it's truly our own voice that is saying that we're not enough, that's our gremlin talking, which is the strongest of the four energy blocks. And the gremlin is that nasty inner critic who tries to protect us from harm by keeping us from moving forward and keeping us safe and telling us to just stay put, stay comfortable, don't move, you're not enough, so don't even try. So if we don't have the awareness of these energy blocks or work with a coach or talk to a peer about what's going on, then they'll fester and ultimately keep us so frozen in fear because that fear will become our only reality.
Oh, absolutely. And these first two, like assumptions and limiting beliefs, they're either direct experience or indirect experience, right? It's that they're the hand me down or the direct experience. So from a reliability perspective, right? So when we're thinking about risks and we rely on assumptions and limiting beliefs, they tend to have a lot of credibility, right? Because it's you can point to something and say, I either experienced it firsthand or someone I trust or somebody I believe, whether that's the gremlin or a family member, told me about this. And so they have a lot of credibility. The next two mistakes is where we actually don't have that kind of credibility, but instead we think we're smarter than the situation in front of us. And it tends to be more of a cognitive issue than an experiential issue. And so the third mistake is when we attempt to kind of create certainty to outweigh uncertainty. And what I mean by that is often when we're uncertain of the outcome of an opportunity, it creates this feeling of it creates ambiguity. And ambiguity is uncomfortable. So we search for certainty to eliminate ambiguity. And if we can't predict the outcome with certainty, we start ascribing certainty to the risks of the situation, the downside. So we tell ourselves it's more realistic to consider the risks as more certain than the outcome. In other words, if I'm going to move and get a new job, and I think that new job is going to be better than my current job, but I don't know, and you can't determine the certainty of it, you start to say, well, what is the risk? Well, the risk is I leave a good job and can't get either a replacement job that's better than or as good as. And so when we start to think about it, we start to put certainty on the risk. And so it's like a hedge for our own disappointment. So mentally, we start comparing the outcome of something that we can't predict to a risk that we suddenly are predicting. And it makes that risk more real and tangible than the opportunity. And it starts to skew our perception and decision making because the risk is real and the upside is not. And so, therefore, if we actually took action to take on this risk, it would seem foolish. It seemed like we're chasing shadows. So, cognitively, we outsmart ourselves. So, we default to risk aversion because we framed the risk as something that's more certain than the outcome, regardless of the fact there's no certainty in any of it, but we fabricated certainty in order to cling on to something, and then that becomes the only real thing. And so the fear keeps us frozen. And that's really tragic because what happens is, again, neither one is certain, but we start to pick one in order to make a decision.
And it becomes our truth, right?
Yeah.
Because as a society, we have become so groomed to believe that there has to be truth and certainty in whatever we're working towards.
Yeah.
So if we can't conceptualize the outcome, then we make the risk our truth because we need that stability, even if it's not serving us.
Absolutely. And sometimes we even know it's not working to our benefit in our heart of hearts, but it's this idea of certainty. It's safety. Yeah, and it's tragic. So the fourth type of mistake deals with extremes, and it's really looking at worst case scenario. And when we think about risks, we tend to go to the worst case scenario, and that's a rational question. Like it's a rational way to think about it of what's the worst that can happen. And there's nothing wrong with assessing a tail event, like the worst that can happen. The mistake occurs when we actually start to over amplify the probability that the worst case scenario will happen. And we do this because we're only focused on the extreme outcome, right? We go to the worst case scenario and we focus on it because we're answering the question, what's the worst that can happen? And so we see nothing else. There's no continuum of, well, what's a likely outcome? What's a moderate case scenario? What's the best case scenario? We're only thinking, what's the worst case scenario? So it becomes the one that's real. And the way to think about this is think of a lottery ticket. And so a lottery ticket is the polar opposite of the worst case scenario. But just like a worst case scenario, it's a low probability tail event. But what do? We buy a ticket and we immediately begin thinking about how we're going to spend that money. We take this tail event and start really focusing on it. And the more we think about it, the more certain we become that we have the winner. We get attached to it because we've invested time and energy in it. And it's like the probability didn't change. It's still infinitesimal that it's going to occur. Yet, because that's the only thing we considered, winning and how we're going to spend that money, we've amplified the probability in our head to the point where now we expect it to happen. That when it doesn't happen, we're actually disappointed. So if you take this lottery ticket example and you use this logic on a worst case scenario, we can actually wrangle in fear and make risk more acceptable. So, for example, when we consider the worst case scenario and we plan how we're going to survive it, just like the same way that we plan how we're going to spend our lottery winnings, we can actually remind ourselves that it's as likely as winning the lottery. So I can sit there and say, what's the worst that can happen to me? And how am I going to survive it? It's no different than me saying, I've got a lottery ticket that's a winning. How am I going to spend it? The difference is with the lottery ticket, I didn't go on a spending spree as soon as I bought the lottery ticket prior to the drawing. So the idea that I would respond to worst case scenario outcomes right now is just as silly. You don't assume the worst case scenario is going to come to pass. What you do is you challenge your ability and accept it and use it as a marker to say, well, if I can survive the worst case scenario, then I can actually handle every other probable outcome. And so I use this with a lot of my clients, and inherently, our imagination is really, really great at coming up with worst case scenarios and playing out all the potential negative things that can happen. And we forget that our imagination can also come up with the opposite, with the good things that can happen. It's so often we look at a risk and we only see the downside. We don't actually sit there and say, well, this risk is paired with an opportunity, it's paired with an upside. So, what's the upside? So after like discussing the worst case scenario and helping clients see that they're strong enough to handle whatever comes their way, we then start to shift that mindset into that potential outcome and say, okay, well, what else could happen? What's on the other end of the spectrum? And let's find a way to actually think about this. It encourages them to actually move forward.
And that is so strong because when I think about the 8 steps to cultivating resilience, one of them is that imagination piece. Our imagination is so incredibly strong. Like you were saying with the lottery ticket, our imagination runs wild with that best case scenario. But it only runs wild when we physically buy a ticket. So it's not an everyday thing and it's triggered by an action. But when you think about the worst case scenario, our negative thoughts take control. And I actually mentioned this in my last episode, but we have 50 to 80,000 thoughts per day, and 65 to 85% of them are negative, which means that we are incredibly practiced at using our imagination to depict the worst case scenario and thinking about how bad our lives could be. And then we just get stuck with it because we don't know how to challenge it because negative is the default. Cultivating resilience is all about taking that 30,000 foot view and ultimately being aware enough to challenge that there are more truths and possibilities than the worst case scenario and practicing looking for the positive outcome. So wherever we do end up, resilience is all about knowing that we're strong enough to handle it. Or if we don't specifically know how to handle it or process it, then resilience is also about knowing that we have a support network to help us. So I think a great example that relates to everyone is taxes, right? We know that we have to file and pay them every year, but they're complicated. So rather than trying to do them ourselves, we turn to either a professional or a software and ask for guidance or help through that process. And when people are thinking about risks or worst case scenarios, and they're trying to think about what to do next or how to move forward, they're often focused solely on what they personally can handle or understand. And to their gremlin's delight, they forget about their support network. So just a plug here that when you are assessing your risks and trying to figure stuff out, it's okay to ask for help. It's totally okay to phone a friend and get somebody else's buy-in on what they think is going on and their assessment of the bigger picture, and even ask them to challenge some of your truths. And you can take that bigger picture and combine it with your intuition and your values and use all of that to determine what your next right step is. So, especially during this pandemic, lean on your support network and ask for help. Resilience and inner strength doesn't mean having to forge it alone by any means. And usually those who really understand their weaknesses end up being the most resilient and the most successful, because rather than beating themselves up or seeing themselves as a failure, they just ask for help and keep moving forward.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really great point, and it can't be overemphasized. So when you talked earlier about like acceptance and resilience, when we think about worst case scenarios, and it happens with all forms of risk, worst case scenario is just a label for it. A lot of the time, the resiliency is the idea that I will be okay, that I will get through this, that I will survive. And that's key, because a person needs to focus on the outcome. And where a lot of us run into problems is that middle piece. And it's the, okay, I can say I will be okay. But then the next question is, but how? And that how is really where all the fear lays. Because I can sit there and say, I'm going to be fine at the end of this. I have resilience. And then I start to say, okay, well, how am I going to be fine? And then I start to think about, oh, well, I don't know how to do this. I can't do this. And you start to identify all of your shortcomings. And it's, well, I don't know how. And so suddenly, because we can't answer how, we suddenly think the outcome is now in jeopardy because we can't explain the how. The outcome was never in jeopardy. And what you pointed out about asking for help is the magic wild card that answers how. Because oftentimes when we think about how am I going to get through this, we're only thinking about what we can affect and what we can do. And when you suddenly throw out the wild card of, well, I can ask for help. Well, that's the magic elixir. That solves everything. Poof, how was just answered. I ask for help. And you don't stop and say, well, what does the help do? Well, how is help going to solve it? Because the answer is simple. Help, ask for help. Okay, poof, done, solved. Okay, well, now my outcome isn't in jeopardy because I know I either know how to solve it or I ask for help. That is my how. And suddenly it makes sense. And that brings down the anxiety so much. And it makes that power of acceptance that much stronger for people. And so I think asking for help can't be overemphasized.
I love that, the magic elixir. Okay, so I know that you and I can talk for hours about gremlins and risks and fears and helping people cultivate resilience and navigate this pandemic, but we have already thrown a lot of information out there. So I'm going to end with one final question for you, and that is, as it relates specifically to navigating the current state of the pandemic, what is one thing that people can do to start practicing taking these calculated risks and really living their lives again?
Well, I think it's actually what we just touched on too. It's the start with the outcome of your own resilience. I will be okay. I don't need to worry about the how. I will be okay. And what that does is it puts a floor on risk, and it allows us to accept it. If you know that at the outcome of this, regardless of what happens or how it happens, I will be okay, then that really, like I said, that takes the anxiety out of it. It puts us more in an acceptance because now we can accept change because we don't know the path change is going to take us on, but we know when it's over or when it gets to a spot where it levels, I will be okay. So I think that's key. Walking into the situations with the resilience enough to say, I will be okay at the outcome and I need to accept this and go along for the ride.
Spot on. I will be okay. I am strong enough. I can handle this. Rob, thank you again so much for joining me on the Conshy Coaching Podcast. As always, you are welcome back here anytime.
Yeah, same here. I love these conversations. They're a lot of fun, and I look forward to it.
That was episode 11 of the Conshy Coaching Podcast. If you'd like to connect with Rob Tull, I've included his website, pathtocoaching.com, in the episode notes. If you'd like to learn more about cultivating resilience, becoming fearless, or to download workbooks to support your journey to self-discovery, please visit conshycoaching.com. As always, if you like learning about mindset and energy leadership coaching, please subscribe to my channel and join my weekly email list so that you never miss an episode or a blog post. Thanks for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day.